brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village at Britain, the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead. And here we go. Okay, so we are on episode 34. We're still on the Greco-Persian Wars. We're on second stage of the Greco-Persian Wars. Shout out, as always, goes out to Marwaen and the Tutumens, I guess, historic discussion space, because Tutumens is enough to take any country. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? What a Tumen is? It's a Mongolian unit of military. 10,000. That's what it took to take Russia. Well, Rus back in the day. Because 2 Tumens is enough to take anything. 3 is too many. But anyway, shout out to them, guys. Shout out to Herodotus for writing down a lot of his thoughts and I guess interviews regarding this particular campaign and the story of this entire conflict. And shout out to pretty much everybody out there who has done an amazing amounts of research, because this is, again, probably one of the most researched aspect of Western history. And no shout out to the people who made the movie 300 Spartans or the follow-up, which is a joke. No shout out to you guys suck. Darius, or better known as King Darius, he did not manage to conquer Greece, and he was not terribly involved. That was not his probably top priority at the time when it was happening. We got to remember that the Persians had an empire which stretched as far as northern India on the one end, that bordered with Arabia on the other end, and that pretty much reached into Ukraine yet on another end. So Persians had quite a bit of territory, and comparing to the size of Persian Empire, the Greek city-states were just minuscule. Besides about half of them, the ones that were on the Anatolian part of that region, of those states, were more or less already Persian anyway, and were fighting actively on Persian side. I'm going to try to pull up a map real quick. So I mean, this is, then we're looking not at all of the Persian Empire. We're looking just a little piece of the Persian Empire. You can see the size of them. By the time we're talking about, Macedonia was already taken. Thrace was taken firmly by Persia. Ionia has been pulled back into the fold, and all those little islands right here have been taken into the fold. So the size of Persian Empire, again, we're looking at a fraction, but here, actually, I think Persia was the largest land empire until the Mongols, I think. Close to, no, Rome, I think Rome equaled Persian Empire in size, equaled it, but Mongols were the first ones that outdid it in size. So, I mean, to give you an idea, it was a huge.
Square kilometers out.
Yeah, well,
Rome may have been slightly bigger.
It's right up there with Rome and Mongolian Empire. So, to them, these little troublesome city-states were really not much more than a lot of trouble. Now, I happily forgot what year Darius passed away, so I'm going to double check that real quick. I know that. I guess I can just put that in there later. I forgot it, but bottom line is, shortly into his preparation for the second campaign against the Greeks, Darius, who did intend to eventually take those troublesome Greek city-states, did wind up passing away, and his heir came to the throne. And of course, when you have a switch of dynasty, or not dynasty, switch of ruler in the Persian Empire, this is probably one of the first times when it was fairly peaceful in a long while, because there were some problems and some unrest. There was a lot of celebration. There was a lot of celebration to be done. There were a lot of state affairs to be taken care of. Now, Darius's heir, the man whom we all know as Xerxes, whose actual name was Shayarshin, Xerxes. Of course, Greeks could not pronounce Shayarshin, and therefore that's why they called him by this shortened version that we now pronounce as Xerxes. Shayarshin the Magnificent was the golden boy. He was the Prince Charming. He was the honed tuned, pampered, spoiled rotten heir of a very successful and a very magnificent king, even though Xerxes himself went by the moniker, the nickname of Magnificent. Really, the one who was truly magnificent, the one who was truly awesome, would have been Darius, and before him, his that kind of distant relative, kind of a second, twice removed grandpa, and that would be Cyrus. So Xerxes comes to the throne. And we must celebrate the crowning of this wonderful young man. Xerxes was basically the apple of his father's eye. He was healthy. He was smart. He was exceptionally attractive. Even his enemies described him as a very extremely attractive man who is healthy, who is fit, who's charming. He's brilliantly educated. As I mentioned in the previous episode, he's educated by the best teachers of Babylon, educated in the art of love by the best priestesses of the Temple of Ishtar. He's surrounded by most loyal servants and the most wise advisors. He pretty much more or less thinks he must be somewhat of a god. And this often happens when we have a great ruler who, with much difficulties, comes to the throne. And after managing to make that throne very comfortable to be on, to stabilize it, that consolidate his rule, he winds up having an heir who is brought up in such luxury because the father has suffered so much hardship in the coming to this particular throne that he tries to save his son from having the same experience. And as a result, what we have on the throne is somebody who is not necessarily anything near being as fit to rule as the father before him. That was very much the case with Xerxes, because Xerxes held a celebration for X amount of months in Babylon. And then, of course, he had to go to Egypt and have another celebration there for his crowning. And Xerxes was looking around and he was thinking to himself, I'm young, I am beautiful, I am very well known, I'm charming, everybody loves me, and I'm probably God. But, everybody before me, they had these glorious campaigns. They were all known as warriors. What should I do? Well, let's see. Egypt has been conquered. As far as we can go, here is Nathan. Egypt has been conquered. All the neighboring little states have been conquered. The Phoenicians are pretty much our most loyal allies. They're our fleet. They're in my pocket. Where can I show my glorious self? Xerxes decides that it is time to finish what his father has started. Darius was not able to conquer Greece. Xerxes thinks that he will. And so 10 years have passed since the last time that Persians attempted to attack the Greek city-states on mainland Greece. Xerxes gathers up his forces into an army, an enormous army. Now, Herodotus tells us that his army was something like 1 million people. It would be awesome if he told us that it was 1 million people in the sense of it was many, many, many people. No, he gives us a countdown to the last numbers, which is kind of weird because at that point in time, the entire population of both Persian Empire and Greece most likely did not equal quite that amount of people. Well, as far as, able-bodied fighting men of the right draft age. So what did this army consist of? Well, this army mostly consisted, first of all, of the auxiliary troops, which would be a lot of the Scythian tribes that his father Darius has recently more or less conquered, the Saki Scythian tribes and other people that were also Indo-European descendants that were still roaming through the steppes of what is now Ukraine. It consists, of course, of all the other conquered peoples. So it is a more or less, it's kind of unhomogeneous admixture of different fighting styles, different training styles, different mentalities, different customs, and frankly, different languages. Xerxes sets out to conquer Greece. His father used to be able, his great-grandfather, if he was related, Cyrus, they used to ride along with the soldiers in their chariots, sleep on the ground. When the soldiers slept on the ground, eat the same salted meat as the soldiers ate. Nope, not our Prince Charming. Xerxes has a golden chariot. He packs up all his dancers and his pillows and cushions and his fine wines and his favorite flavors of haoma. And he more or less loads up his lovely golden throne in case he needs to get started, needs to take a break. And, and this very manly, very hardy, very military-like manner, our young Xerxes sets out to conquer Greece. Well, what's been going on in Greece in the meanwhile? 10 years have passed. Athens knows people. Well, Athens cannot know anything because Athens is a city, but people of Athens are more or less aware that yes, they were really stuck our nose into Persian affairs. We pissed off the Persians very much. They tried to teach us a lesson in a marathon. We kicked their butt. We showed them what Greeks are made of, and now they're never going to come back and harass us again. And that's more or less the overall attitude of majority of the Athenians, because not only did they beat the famous Persian army, they also did it without the help of Sparta. So, yeah, Spartans, we don't need your help. We're Athens, we're bad, we're awesome. We can defeat this horrible army all on our own. Well, in the city of Athens, interesting political undertakings are happening. They have fairly recently overthrown their tyrants and their kings and every sort of form of what they consider to be dictatorship type rule. And so they are now practicing this democracy thing. Now, when democracy first started, it was mostly involving people who may have not been the aristocrats, because aristocrats got thrown out of Athens or they were forced to kind of join the masses. But it was still well-to-do people, the well-known people, the well-respected people that were still a part of this process. There's a lot of rabble also, like a lot of just kind of people living in the city who are poor, who are maybe are not citizens of Athens. They are maybe Greeks from nearby polises that for whatever reason lost their citizenship in their previous place of residence. Because in Greece, if you did not have citizenship in a polis, you were pretty much not considered to be full worthy individual. I mean, you had no fewer rights and you were not able to make any votes in a democratic sort of thing. So there are a couple of very bright leaders that are happening with this time in Athens. And one of them is a descendant of previous aristocratic lines, and that's Aristid. And he is a very noble, very likable, very decent, and very trustworthy man. He's very much lawful good. He is very righteous. He's good. He's so good that people of Athens are starting to hate his guts. And then there's Themistocles, who is more or less kind of upper middle class, fairly rich, not particularly aristocratic, not as noble of birth, and very, very charismatic. Themistocles is somebody we're going to be dealing with throughout the remainder of these Greco-Persian wars. So I'm going to pull up an image of him real quick, at least what is believed to be an image of him. Gotta move you guys over, find my Themistocles. It's not him, obviously. But this is one of the very first very astute. Wow, I'm totally in the wrong. No, never mind. I'm not going to share that with you because I'm in the wrong window. But anyway, he's somebody who is a very astute, very shrewd politician. When him and Aristides, I guess is how you would say it in English language, because there's that S that you guys add on to every Greek name for some reason. But anyway, when they were having their debates and their kind of back and forth speeches on the agora, basically, I mean, they were not above calling each other. I mean, it's not very different than today's presidential debates. Oh, well, your mother, she was actually a Scythian slave. Oh, yeah, well, your father never wrote down your citizenship. Oh, yeah, well, you've, and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of poop throwing between the two of them. So much so that the people of Athens finally got sick and tired of it, and they said, one of you all has to go. And so they did hold the ceremony, which they called Astragism. When you voted, it was like a negative vote. Rather than electing a person for something good, you'd elect a person for something bad. And so every Greek who participated in the vote had got to choose who they wanted to see gone from the city, who has annoyed them the most. And that's where the famous story comes from. Let me just pull up that picture again real quick. Now I have the right picture of Aristide, who was walking up to the meeting of his peers for that very procedure, and he met a poor peasant. This is not Aristide. This is Themistocles. At least this is believed to be his image. But Aristide was walking up to the agora. Everybody was having this gathering. They were going to ostracize somebody, and a peasant who came across his way who didn't know how to write very well, and he said, "Good sir, you're educated. You obviously look like you're somebody who knows grammar and writing. So would you mind filling basically this blank for me?" And he said, "Very well, good fellow citizen, whom do you want me to write in? He said, well, I want you to go ahead and write in Aristide. And very clear, almost like calligraphic Greek writing, Aristide wrote on his name. And he said, well, may I ask you, good citizen, what is it that Aristide has done to you? Why do you want him gone so badly? And the citizen said, I hear everywhere, Aristide the noble, Aristide the good, Aristide this, Aristide that. I'm sick of him. So Aristide went away, and Themistocles stayed. Themistocles stayed, and he was much more alert to the upcoming Persian danger than the people around him in the city. He had a vision. He wanted to create a fleet because he had a pretty strong feeling that the Persians are going to come back, and they're going to come back by sea because that's what they did last time, and that at the very least, Athens, preferably all the Greeks, city-states that were near the seashore, should have some sort of defenses. The problem was, how do you finance this? How do you convince people to finance this when most of your compatriots are pretty much cheering and saying, nah, we showed them, where the moon shines during the marathon battle, they ain't coming back, but they're afraid of us. Well, he decided that he was going to, let me back up. Now, in Athens, they had this whole kind of city-owned natural resources deal. Like today in certain in certain countries, if there's an oil deposit or gas deposit, it's automatically owned by the state, and then the proceeds from it go to the peoples of the state oftentimes. Athens had the same sort of policy, and they did have some silver mines that they were aware of, that they've been working on for years. But right about this time, nearing this confrontation with the Persian Empire, much more silver deposits were discovered at those mines. And so suddenly there was quite a bit of money that flowed into the Athenian treasury. Normally what they would do is take that money, break it up, divide it by the number of Athenian citizens. Of course, the women, children, and slaves were excluded. We're talking about only citizen Athenian males, and they would get a payout. Well, the amount that each citizen would get from that payout was really not very much. And so Themistocles got this idea: we should use this money, rather than paying individuals this little bits of money, we should use this money to build us most modern, most upscale, most war-capable fleet of ships. I'm going to stop for a second, see if anybody wants to jump in.
So there we go. Can everybody hear me? Good.
Hear you now.
All right. Just wanted to mention a couple of things about Xerxes, or how's it properly said?
Xerxes.
Okay. I meant his Persian name. Okay, there you go. Anyway, he was not even Darius's oldest son. And when he was brought up as that well-to-do prince, but he was the first son born under Darius's kingship, or having been assigned the kingship, or having taken it, depending on who you want to believe. But he also, right after his coronation or whatever, they would have a serious revolt in Egypt, and he would go to put it down. Then the Babylonians, being Babylonians, couldn't leave well enough alone, and they would rebel, and there would actually have to be a siege of Babylon, and the elites would be carried off, and allegedly even the statue of Mamluk would be carried off to Iran and melted down. But I just wanted to point out Babylonia's remarkable ability to shoot themselves in the foot, because they always have. They had special privileges, and they were the capital of the empire at that point. Then they were broke down into several satrapacies from one big one, and their elites were probably moved off. But so Xerxes was well educated, and he was about 36 years old when he took the throne. So he wasn't a boy. He was probably a little overconfident and stuff due to some of his decisions, but I don't know that I buy that he was incompetent. I don't know, just hard to tell from 2,500 years away. But that's my take. There you go.
I'm back.
I'm not there yet. Come on. There we go. Ghost. Yeah, I'm done.
Yeah.
Okay, can anybody hear me? Is everything okay? Okay, sorry about that. Like I said, bunch of coronation celebrations in Babylon and Egypt. One rebellion, two rebellions. Go ahead, Nathan.
Just a quick comment on Herodotus, and follows a kind of an old adage that if someone said, "I saw elephants flying today," it would be you would not believe that. But if you said, "I saw 47 elephants flying today," it's much more believable.
Right.
So, just an old adage.
Right. Well, and you got to remember that almost all portrayals of Xerxes that we get really are from the Greek point of view, which was not exactly complimentary. There is a reason why. I mean, he was young comparing to his father, who was quite advanced years, and he was also young in the sense of his experience in governing. I mean, yes, he's governed under his father's direction up until this point in time, but there's certain episodes that come to us from those times, that even though they come through the Greek prism, Greek propaganda prism, it doesn't necessarily mean that there was not some. I mean, where there's smoke, there's usually some sort of fire, right? And so repeated tales of his inability to control his temper, his kind of on-the-fly decision-making, which was not very, never been mentioned about any of his predecessors as far as people on the Persian throne. I mean, Xerxes seemed to be fairly used to the fact that whatever he wanted to get done got done right now at any cost, and that he was going to be successful. And I think that's what I mean by the golden boy. I'm not saying that he was a child. I'm just saying that he was a man who was drunk almost on his success and his own lineage, and who expected things to fall easily to his lap, which they started to not do very shortly. So back to, did anybody else want to jump in with anything before we continue? Okay. So Themistocles manages to convince his fellow Athenians to go ahead and donate these proceeds from the silver mines to building a very modern, very upscale, upgraded, seaworthy, sea-capable fleet. He actually talks to the most wealthy people's citizens of the city-state, and kind of creates almost a competition between them to where, hey, we're going to give, how about you build this many ships? Well, can you finance this many ships? To where it's almost a competition. So both the state money and then private money of rich folks start going towards building of these ships. Well, the question is now, who are you going to have powering these ships, right? Because a ship in Greece, of course, does not get powered by itself. It gets powered by a person who sits there rowing or so forth. Well, noblemen most likely did not particularly want to be rowing. Let me pull it up for you guys. So he comes up with this idea: why don't we take the city poor? Why don't we train them to be the rowers on these ships? I mean, they're kind of more or less homeless people hanging around the outskirts of Athens. Why don't we give them some work, pay them some money, some wages, so that they can no longer sit there in poverty, and so that we have people who are willing to undertake these difficult tasks of rowing the ships. And so by doing that in a weird kind of way, whether intentionally or not, and that is still being debated by a lot of modern scientists. So anybody going from historian to somebody who's a history of philosophy, history of political science, whether or not that this was something that he did on purpose or whether it was a byproduct of his actions. But suddenly these homeless, nameless, and kind of powerless masses gain more of a voice, and by his actions, by his involving and giving status to the most poor people in the city, he almost radicalizes the concept of democracy, which already existed in Athens. And Athens is, of course, the most radical democracy we see. The other thing that he does, up until this point in time, Athens has been still governed by an institute of archons. It's a very old institute. It's very archaic. There's 7 of them. They were originally the procedure was that they would be elected by all the people. And this was even in the king's times, and there was kind of a council of elders, or the council of the most powerful, influential men. And because they were elected, the people who oftentimes would wind up in this position would be in fact the most politically capable, the most influential, the most outstanding citizens. And the top of the seventh of the archons was more or less an equivalent of I don't know, mayor or president, he had quite a bit of clout. And at the same time, Athenians had this position of strategist, which was a military position, and was somebody who would command the troops during wartime, and somebody who wouldn't be able to make decisions for the city during the wartime. And though they were also elected, so with the Archon Institute, every Greek could serve in the role of an Archon for 1 year only in his life, and never would be able to be reelected again. While the strategists, because the Greeks realized that sometimes there were campaigns that went on more than a single year, they could be elected for longer terms, or they could be elected repeatedly, or again over a period of time. And so what Themistocles managed to push through the public, he was an outstanding orator. I mean, he was extremely convincing, terribly charismatic, extremely shrewd. And he pushed this law that said that from now on, the position of Archon will not be in a position you're elected to. It will be decided by draw of the straw, basically. So instead of the most wealthy, most influential, the most charismatic, and the most capable people being elected to that position, now you have just absolutely random people. What that did is it lowered the influence of the position of an Archon, and it increased the influence of the position of a strategist. And because Themistocles was not of as high of a birth as Aristide was, because he did spend quite a bit of his money, because he was not, and his action was so much directed towards the demos, the people, the poorest classes. He did have very wide support of the public, especially the least wealthy of the Athenian citizens. So because he had this influence, he did manage to push through the election process the fact that yes, we're going to be building these ships. But a lot of the people in Athens did not think that they were under threat, so they didn't want to build a fleet against potential for Persian invasion. Well, Themistocles was worried about their potential invasion again, and so he gave them a false target. He said that there was an island of Aterna, that they were having some, sea marine and some kind of military conflicts with, and that they were building the fleet actually to strive off these meddlesome neighbors. When in reality, what he was preparing was the Persian invasion, and he was right. So in 480 BC, Xerxes undertook his famous trek into Greece, with the desire to punish these barbarous Devas worshippers who his father was not able to finish punishing, and to punish Athens, to punish Sparta, and basically to conquer that territory. And of course, before proceeding, he did what the Persians always did. He sent out his ambassadors to all the Greek city-states, saying that, look, I'm coming. We can do war, or we can do this nicely. If you want to bow down to me, we can do this nicely. So what you can tell? What's your take? The only two city-states that he did not send any ambassadors to, of course, were Athens and Sparta, because
Sparta, he did to Sparta.
Not the second time. No, he didn't, because the first time that both of those city-states killed their ambassadors. So the second, Darius did send his ambassadors, but after both of them were killed, I think that he was done sending anybody to anyone. So when the news of this advancing threat came, of course, Athens, knowing that they were target, and Sparta, knowing that they were definitely a target, started running around in circles going, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And they tried to gather up all the city-states that would join them in this union, and this kind of a joint effort to fight off the Greeks. Well, that was really nice of them, but let me just pull up. I have a map somewhere which city-states allied. A lot of the Greek city-states, even on mainland Greece, said, no, thank you, goodbye. We do not want to have anything to do with you. You're not good news. We don't want to do any war. You're crazy. We will never hear this. Open it up again. Bottom line is, out of the multitude, and I'm talking about hundreds of the city-states that existed in Greece at the time, only 31 joined this union. And it was the Peloponnesian Union of city-states that decided that they were, in fact, going to fight against the invading Persian army. As you can see here, I mean, Macedonia already been conquered, right? All these city-states already have pretty much bowed down. So the ones that were left that were even looking to fight off the impending invasion really were just these few city-states right here. So all members of all these states, they gathered together and they wanted to discuss how, I mean, they realized that they have different kind of traditions on how they run their military and how they can do, wartime efforts. And so they held a vote and they all decided that Sparta was going to be in charge of the military campaign because Spartans were known in Greece as very tough and very kind of capable soldiers. So with Spartans in charge, they started debating, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to defend our land from this impending doom? And at first, originally, they were hoping to stop the incoming land army, that because the Persians moved in two different routes. They had the fleet and they also had the land army, and the fleet was supposed to be, on the one hand, transporting the land army when need be, but it also was supposed to be supplying the land army, running supplies to the land army, because it was this kind of a mass of people. I mean, according to Herodotus, it was 1 million people. I strongly doubt it was. Most likely it was something along the lines of probably 200,000, 250,000 at most. And that's including auxiliary troops.
Okay, just a couple of things. One, those numbers, maybe 250,000 and maybe another 100,000 camp followers or something like that. They would have had big, since they were able to travel over land, they could bring much larger cavalry forces than they did last time. And probably the fleet, they actually built, I believe, 2 bridges of old ships for the logistics. So Herodotus may not have been, he may have been only 3 times as many people or something, if you count camp followers and all that. But yeah, and even 200,000 is stretching your logistics to near the limit. With ships, that would help, but storms can be awful too.
Yeah, to add to what David just said, it's about a 3-to-1, 4-to-1 for frontline, even at that in that time, frontline effective combat infantry with supporting logistics. You have people running boats, you have people providing food, people running camps, camp followers, just all of the support. It's and so it takes a lot to run an army.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely.
Especially one that big.
Absolutely. And I just pulled up a map of, again, of how they advanced.
And when you're attacking a defended position, you need 4 to 5 times as many troops. So you're talking about huge amounts of people being moved.
Right. So here's the Impingus, where Xerxes' troops marched by land, this passage right here. And originally the Greeks were hoping to stop the Persian, well, not stop, but at least hold off the Persian invasion somewhere here. But in reality, by the time they decided what to do, the Persians have already gotten past that point. And then by sea, you can see where Xerxes' fleet was traveling, kind of hugging the outlines of the land very close, again, like I said above, to stay in touch, be able to stay in touch with their troops, to be able to supply them and so forth. So this is where after the Greeks failed to stop the Persian advance, originally when the Persians were first crossing into the Greek territory, that's when the famous stand of the 300 Spartans and the lovely movie based on it and all of that lovely stuff was made. The idea was not, of course, to stop the Greeks, to stop the Persians, because the Greeks were not quite. The Greeks. Half of the Greek city-states basically threw out a white flag and said, okay, we're with you Persians, we're not going to cause you any problems, go ahead and march through our territories. The other half, the 31 states, did agree to continue fighting, and among those, of course, were the Spartans, who were in charge of the entire campaign, and because this was going to be an awesome and glorious battle. And previously at Marathon, the Spartans did not make it, as we remember, for religious reasons. They were busy celebrating a religious holiday that did not permit them to do such things as fight in a war. The Spartans sent their elite troops. Now, when everybody I'm sure knows by now that there was not 300 Spartans holding down that mountainous path, that there was in fact a lot more Spartans than that, that there were allied troops there with the Spartans. There was a total of about 3,000 plus or minus at least people there originally. So there's the Persian army marching. There's the Persian fleet. This right here is Thessalia, right? This is Macedonia, which already is totally Persian by this point in time. By the way, in the midst of all of this, yeah, in the midst of all of this happening, the Greeks have their famous Olympic competition going on, which they were very fond of, and which was very much a religious undertaking to uphold the Greek city-states, during which they usually declare peace, which is one of the reasons why the entire Greek army was not able to meet the Persian threat right here. And that's why they had to select specific individual troops, basically kind of an elite group, to hold the Persians down while the rest of the Greeks finished celebrating their festivals, their festivities and sacrificing to the gods and so forth. So the 300 elite Spartans make their famous last stand. A last stand that which Xerxes was woefully unprepared for. It's likely that he first sent in his allied Scythian troops, or rather his auxiliary Scythian and Saki troops, before taking the Greeks very seriously. The fact that they, meaning the Persians, kept attacking, so the 300 Spartans, as they're known, so head-on for a long period of time, I think that Xerxes has not quite figured out exactly how determined the Greeks were. Well, I think that he just thought that he was going to run them over with the sheer steamroller of his multitudes. But because the Greeks chose such a narrow passage, they were able to defend it fairly effectively for 3 days. And Xerxes did something which does not show him to me from the best side. Oh, by the way, to back up, when they were crossing into them, that's about the bridges. And this is back to Xerxes' character. I mean, I like the Persians. Xerxes, I'm not so sure. The whole instance was when the Persian army was needing to cross the sea, and they built a pontoon bridge, and a storm came and blew that bridge away. Well, there's a story, again, it comes from Herodotus, so take it with a grain of salt. But there is the story that Xerxes got very angry and he ordered his soldiers to whip the sea. Now, keep in mind that we hear a very similar story, for example, about Caligula from the Romans. So how much this is anything that has to do with actual Xerxes and how much it is basically an urban legend that keeps migrating from one culture to another is a whole separate subject. But that is written down. That kind of indicates at least somebody who was not very used to not having his way. First of all, why did the Spartans not retreat? Well, they did not retreat according to a lot of sources because it was against Spartan morality code to retreat. That makes no sense to me because Spartans, no matter what their ethics were very hardy warriors. And these 300 were the elite of the elite, cream of the crop of Spartan army. And to lose that many people at once may have not been necessarily strategically or tactically advantageous. There is a mention that there was a prophecy in Sparta that either the king is going to die or Sparta is going to fall. And it's entirely possible that Leonidas decided to stay behind in order to sacrifice himself and fulfill the prophecy in favor of his city-state. All right, I'm stopping for a second, seeing if anybody has anything to say.
My understanding is that the Greeks at Thermopylae they were cut off from behind, and so they were trapped, and retreat was not possible.
Before they got actually cut off, they got news that the Persians were coming. And at that point in time, actually, Leonidas sent off all of his other allies, non-Spartans. What happened is Leonidas could have technically retreated. He could have. I mean, he had enough time. They could have snuck out in the middle of the night. He managed to send off all his other troops, but he did not send off with his own soldiers. He decided to stay. Yeah, I think there was one Southern Plataeans who stayed behind or something like that. My numbers may be off, but there was another group of soldiers that stayed with him. But I'm pretty sure he sent most of them off towards the end. And then there was one particular Spartan whose fate was quite unfortunate. He was ill at the time of the battle took place. He actually got either wounded or was seriously sick with something. Bottom line is he was sent off to a nearby village to recover. So when the battle took place, he was the only one of the 300 that survived. And when he made it back home, he was so reviled, so looked down upon, and so just his reputation was destroyed for having survived that battle, that when finally at the end of this whole war, when the battle at the plateau was going to take place, he more or less, plateau in English pronunciation, he more or less threw himself into the thick of the battle to just prove to everybody he was not a coward and he did not run from the enemy. Okay,
I'd actually never heard any of that story before, but that does square away with what I understood about Spartans before. You never ever back down, basically.
Just a couple things. That narrow pass is ideal for defense. You would have thought the pathway that they were able to turn their flanks on, you would have thought they would have, being locals, have done a little better reconnaissance on that and defended it as well. But apparently that didn't happen. So that's a very narrow, as I understand it, a few hundred feet from rock face on one side to the sea on the other, or the cliffs that lead to the sea. So it's a very good place to hold up a big force. Given the Spartan mentality, another reason for that last stand, or letting themselves get caught in that last stand, might have been because Greeks in general were considered heavy infantry, valued by the Persians. They were mercenaries, were used a lot by the Persian. Yeah, but they were very heavy infantry. And to one of Leonidas's motives might have been to inflict enough casualties in proportion to the casualties lost to give pause. Yeah, if they could inflict 5,000 casualties, and I don't know that we even have the numbers that were inflicted on the Persians, but if they could inflict a lot of casualties, that would boost the morale and possibly get those neutral cities off the fence.
Okay, so first of all, actually they were aware of that back passage. They were aware of it, and they actually did leave some people, a lookout group, to watch that particular passageway. But when the Persians came through, they came through in such a force that they drove that group up and really high onto the cliffs, and they were not able to communicate. Leonidas did know that the Persians were coming, but they were not able to do anything to stop the Persians. And there's some indications that the individuals who were first thrown up against the Greeks were the Saki, who were not very heavy infantry, and they were not in a position to be fighting in the cavalry formation. In that situation, horses do not do well against a lot of spears pointing at their chest. Horses tend not to like that. They tend to back up and kind of behave not very nicely. So most likely what originally was done is the auxiliary forces and the non-elite forces were fairly lightly armored, were thrown up against heavily armored Greek phalanx. They were the ones who filled up that passageway more or less with bodies, and only after that did Xerxes finally send in his Immortals, which were the elite Persian troops. And not until the Immortals were involved were they able to get rid of this obstacle in their way, plus being able to hit them in the back. What I was going to say about Xerxes' personality and his temperament is that after this battle, Xerxes did something that was very un-Persian in a way, and was not very flattering, I think, of Xerxes as an individual. It's something that Persians have never permitted themselves to do before or after this particular instance that's recorded, and that is he had Leonidas's body found, and he had it, some sources say that he had it crucified, but the bottom line is he showed some sort of disrespect to Leonidas's remains after the battle because he was so upset he lost so many men. So at this point in time, once the Persians got through this narrow passageway, that nothing could prevent them from getting to Athens, which was their original target. And the Athenians had to figure out what to do now. So this is where our Thermopylae battle took place, right here. So the Persians are coming through. I'm trying to find. And so this is where the famous Battle of Salamis is going to happen eventually, but right now I'm just showing you where the island was. So this is the island of Salome. And what happened is when the Athenians realized that their city was no longer protected or defended in any way, shape, or form from the advancing enemy army, they had two choices. That either could stay and fight and defend their city, or they could go ahead and try to basically evacuate. Thankfully, they now had a big enough fleet that they could evacuate majority of the population out of the city. Some people wanted to stay and fight, and they would be saying speeches like, let's just line up in front of our city. We will have a second marathon. Athens will have a famous last stand. To which Thermopylae said, that's right, famous last stand, Athens. No. He managed to convince the people to actually evacuate the city, and majority of population evacuated, including slaves. They had to leave, of course, a lot of their goods behind because you can't load gold and things like that and access them to ships, which have a limited number of spots. Some Athenians did stay, mostly some of the priests defending some of the temples stayed behind in hopes that the gates would hold, or their temple, or that the Persians wouldn't touch their temples. But Persians, of course, having been very angry about the burning down of their own temples in the original Ionian rebellion, when Xerxes got to Athens, he ordered the city more or less robbed and burned down. And the Athenians now wound up homeless people, because a Greek citizen without a polis is not a citizen, he's a nobody. So now we have a situation where in this area of Salome, we have all these refugees from Athens who are basically nobody by Greek standards now, but they have the best fleet. And then you have everybody else who is somebody by Greek standards, but their fleet is a little bit secondary. And so that's where a lot of arguments back and forth, when some of the Greek city-states wanted to actually pull back even further and fight a land battle with the advancing Persian army. But Themistocles, his main objective and his main concern was really the Persian fleet. And so he suggested very, very enigmatically that they should stay and fight a sea battle first. And if they could stop the Persian fleet, then the land troops would not be getting supplied, and majority of the invasion would more or less choke in its early stages or semi-early stages. Okay, I'm going to stop here. We're almost over time, so I'm going to see if anybody has any comments, and we're probably going to do the Battle of Salamis next time, because there's quite a bit of politicking going on here, and I kind of just wanted to cover the personalities of the people involved, particularly the much glorified Athenian leader.
Yeah, a wonderful overview covering the personalities. And it's actually a discussion of the personalities that is very often lost in histories. And so just very appreciative and very good overview of the personalities. And if I may, almost like a satire.
Please.
Almost a satire of like Darius, saying to Xerxes, "Wow, that's a big eraser."
Yeah.
And Xerxes responding, "Wow, that was a big pencil."
Well spoken.
That was hysterically funny. That was pretty darn good. Yeah.
Who was? Never mind. Go ahead.
No, do you want to jump in?
No, I don't think I do, because I'm not sure I know what I'm talking about.
Okay, David does not want to jump in. Does anybody else have anything else to say on this? Because otherwise we're going to schedule our next one and head into our lovely Battle of Salamis, where Persians...
I just had a quick question about, so there's a story about he actually ordered his men to whip the sea just because he was so angry.
That's what this legend claims. I'm very doubtful it was quite... most likely, either it's an echo of an ancient ritual that later got repeated in Roman times, and it might have not been him just being angry and trying to beat up the sea. It might have been him actually... Because he was traveling with a lot of Phoenician captains, and we remember that Phoenicians worshipped Dagon, and all the Phoenician captains were in some way priests of Dagon, and that's the god of depth, of Asha, of sea depth. And so what rituals were practiced, what was done for what purpose, who knows? But some sort of echo of that kind of a story does reach us today.
I was just curious because it sounds like screaming at the sky almost.
Mhm.
Pretty much.
Which is probably why Herodotus wrote that down in his story about Xerxes, because Xerxes being the enemy, of course, is a lot of it is kind of caricature representation.
But that was an engineering feat twice.
Yeah, they rebuilt that bridge. So the bridge got blown away by the storm, and then they had to build it a second time,
Which was
and it
really
worked.
impressive.
So that's pretty much it.
Just one last, and I'm just like thinking out loud, talking out loud here as this comes to me. The Greeks have this wonderful ability to create victory out of defeat in the writing, in the portrayal of the history,
Right.
and it's a characteristic that is it's actually like and it seems to me like a Western culture heritage that has been passed on throughout history.
Now, are you saying that they have a way to represent a defeat as a victory, or are they saying they have a way of turning it around? I assume you're saying the second, right?
No, to represent a defeat as a victory.
I think everybody does that. I think that's East, West, Martian, pretty much anytime you have any sort of
Yeah.
state propaganda. But no, but I think for the Greeks, definitely the Greco-Persian wars were very early on, and they were very much defining. They are before the Greco-Persian wars, the word barbarian was just meant somebody who does not speak Greek. After Greco-Persian wars, they became so, I don't know, full of themselves that some Greeks started using the term barbarian as a kind of derogatory term, and they started thinking that maybe we are better than everybody around us because we are Greeks, which wasn't the case prior to this victories. Yeah, I'm letting David jump in.
Okay, just a couple points there again. Remember in Marathon, the Spartans and the Athenians roughly put, well, we don't know, the Spartans, they got there at the end. But they did arrive when they went back to Athens. But there were about 10,000 from Athens itself, and 1,000 from the little city. Yeah. So 10,000 was one of the two biggest cities in Greece. So if we're looking at the Persian army of 250,000, yeah, most of the cities of Greece, the mid-size would have put 3,000 to 5,000 at best, and many of the smaller ones probably 1,000. So you're probably talking pretty small numbers until you get everybody mobilized to fight. And so, and still you're going to be in that initial invasion significantly outnumbered. I would hazard a guess of 120,000, probably is all the full Hoplites that could, not even that, yeah. Might equip more slingers and javelin men and that kind of thing as light infantry, but full-time professional, well, not even professional soldiers, but regular soldiers of Hoplites were pretty limited. So I kind of see where that superiority come from after they were able to turn them around. Because they were fighting the most powerful empire in the world. And so, just that, I will.
You still on?
I'm not.
Julie, next week, when you're on this subject, if you could spend just a little bit of time describing the armor of the hoplite soldiers compared to almost any other soldier in the world at that time, because
Absolutely.
it was a huge difference between what anyone in the Persian army had. Even the Immortals really weren't that armored, versus the elite Greek soldiers were like tanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Then that's a good point. And I actually was going to do that when we were talking about the Battle of Plateau, because that's going to really figure in. But yeah, no, that's a very, very good point. I'm also going to talk about military organization, because I think a big factor in this particular war was, if we wish, we could kind of compare the Persian army to a feudal army, in the sense of that they're elite cavalry and so forth. Feudal army more in spirit, not really in any organization, in the sense that you have individual, because the Persian fighting elite, they were elite. They were kind of like knights. They were fighting the unique individual heroic battles, just like the Greeks used to during the Trojan War, to where now Greeks have turned more into kind of a cohesive military machine that was well-oiled, worked in coordination, and worked in very, very well synchronized manner. And so that anytime you have basically a feudal type army, by feudal I mean an army of individual warriors who all have awesome training. Each one of them is individually amazingly trained, but are not trained to work together as a group on cohesion, versus a very mediocrely trained cohesive army. Oftentimes it's the mediocrely trained cohesive army that actually takes the battlefield in the end of the day. Because of that persistency, that cohesion, that discipline, and that willingness to follow orders, and ability to turn at the drop of a dime, and so on and so forth.
That applies mostly to cavalry.
No, it applies to either, especially.
But there were levies too.
Well, and another thing is that the ability to use cavalry was extremely limited in Greece. Greek terrain, majority of places, is not exactly cavalry conducive. I mean, you got to understand, when Xerxes and his troops got to Greece, they realized that it is really hot, and it's really rocky, and there's nothing but goats and olives and goats, and it's not a very nice place to be. So I think that they were kind of not particularly thrilled about this particular upcoming conquest of theirs.
It's that cohesion of the military, though, that really works. It's like how the Romans took over basically the world later on.
Right. Same principle. Okay, awesome. It's good to see everyone. See you guys. Bye.
Everybody be well. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Campfire, laughter go glow, electrical glow. Both cast our shadows as our legends unfold. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. Will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.